Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
What happens when our ancient evolutionary instincts collide with the rapid advancements of modern technology? Today, we delve into this compelling question with Professor Rob Brooks, an evolutionary biologist at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Professor Brooks has dedicated his career to exploring the intricate dance between sexual selection, human behavior, and cultural evolution. His acclaimed book, Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll: How Evolution Has Shaped the Modern World, earned the Queensland Literary Award for science writing, highlighting his ability to connect evolutionary concepts to everyday life. In his latest work, Artificial Intimacy, Virtual Friends, Digital Lovers, and Algorithmic Matchmakers, he examines how our deep-seated desires for connection are being transformed by artificial intelligence and digital technologies. Join us as we explore the fascinating intersections of biology, technology, and society, and uncover what they reveal about the future of human relationships. Rob, welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. What a pleasure to connect.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. One of your topics of expertise has fascinated me and held my attention for a long time. In your work, you have delved into the truly intricate dynamics of sexual selection, and which has not only shaped our biological traits, but also social behaviors, and especially the modern dating landscape. It seems like many of our evolved instincts, such as selecting mates based on certain traits that signal an advantage in survival to our ancestors, they're increasingly at odds with the realities of our digital life. Dating apps come to mind. They seem to reward traits like appearance, wealth, and status more than other evolved indicators of long-term partnership stability. And now, of course, wealth and status were also tied to having resources. But in a sense, it really seems very skewed, especially towards appearance, amongst other, from what I hear from friends who are going through this dating app process. I'd like to know from you, Rob, do you think the evolutionary pressures that shape mate selection are becoming maladaptive in the context of our modern technology and dating apps?
Look, absolutely. I think that we've always found that what's good for the individual in looking for mates and in deciding how many mates to have and how to treat them, etc., can actually good in the evolutionary sense, that is in terms of leaving more children and grandchildren, etc. Those things can often be at odds with what's good for a society and what's good for the people around them. But you're absolutely right that we're in a completely different game now with dating apps. So if you want to transport yourself back, say, 15, 20,000 years, everybody lived in small groups, maybe 100 to 200, maybe 300 if it was a huge group of people. And so you can imagine in a group that size, how many people would be looking for a mate for the first time. So what we would say is coming onto the mating market. And it wouldn't be very many. If you expand that a little bit to the sort of villages nearby or settlements nearby, the groups you might bump into if you were a mobile foraging society, it's still, you don't meet a potential mate every day. We fast forward then to, say, the Industrial Revolution and the sort of the time up to maybe the end of the last century, where we're living in cities. More than half of the population of the earth is urbanized. So you're encountering thousands of people every day. And that sort of alertness that you're always looking out for somebody who might just be a little bit interested because you might miss the one chance you have to find a mate this year, that alertness is still there, but it's saturated with all the number of people around you. You can imagine how we could get into trouble in society with people misattributing, like, oh, that person's interested in me because, you know, the rules of business and commerce say you smile and you're kind and you're polite to people. And I think So that's one level. And then you go up another level to what young people or people on the dating scene have to do today, which is they have literally hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of possible matches. Now, we know that the people on the dating apps are at least interested in making a match. So there's an advance. But the other side of it is you're seeing a slice of what the person is, just like a billboard. And as we know, the billboard and the product are never going to be the same thing. It's just impossible. So with seeing that slice, but of lots and lots of people, we suddenly have everybody has these really much heightened standards, because what you really want is the folks who have the great billboards. But the folks with the great billboards are doing fine. Everybody else whose billboard is just normal or maybe not quite up to scratch, that's suffering from a lack of attention. So there's a huge difference between the hyper attractive, or at least the people who make really great dating profiles, and the rest of the world. And that leaves a lot of people dissatisfied. It leaves probably more people unable to find a mate than maybe was the case back in the foraging days 15, 20,000 years ago. Paradoxically, because there's so many people around, and yet in the end, nobody really wants to swipe the right direction. I can't even remember which it is on your profile.
Yes, thank you for shining a light on this, Rob. And do you think it is because via social media, via the apps, via technology, pretty much everybody who has access to technology has access to look at the individuals who have, as you call it, a bright billboard, or know how to create an amazing dating profile, even though that might be removed from the actual reality. But what we see is the bright billboard, and that everybody looks towards the bright billboard versus looking towards, hey, especially for a long-term relationship, might not the person who has maybe a less shiny, sparkly, bright billboard, but the content of the billboard is actually much better suited to a long-term sustainable relationship and mutual happiness and respect. But everybody's distracted by the shiny, bright thing. Is that perhaps an issue?
Absolutely. I think the first thing is, if you're lucky enough, if you're an average Joe and you're lucky enough to meet up with somebody and to hit it off online with somebody who is, in all other respects out of your league, that's actually not always a recipe for happiness, because that person is going to be getting a lot of attention from really attractive people around them, and it's quite destabilizing for a relationship. Same thing happens in a long-running relationship when one person suddenly enjoys a bump in status or goes out and does something, has a radical makeover or whatever it is. You often see that mismatch causing tension in the relationship unless you both go there, you both somehow take that step up together. You have to be careful what you wish for, because you may, in fact, if you did land the kinds of people that you're swiping right on, you might, in fact, find that's not a recipe for happiness at all. Exactly what you're saying. Most of the things that make us happy, most of the things that make for a good relationship are currently not easily algorithmic. And so they're not easily put into dating sites, but they're also, it's not just that you can't put them in, because you could specify stuff about that, but they're not as easy to give folks a snapshot while they're swiping, spending half a second per profile or whatever it is. And it's looks. And the thing is that the looks are, you've got both machines judging people's looks by looking at their picture and decomposing it and saying what makes a good picture, what doesn't. That's a very easy job now for machine learning. But you've also got thousands and thousands of ratings. How many times does this person get swiped left? How many times do they get swiped right? And as a consequence of that, the machines definitely know how attractive people are on average. And what they do is they match you to folks who are a little bit above you to quite a bit above you, because you want to believe. You want to believe that there's a chance that you're going to get together with this really attractive person. But the other stuff that makes for a good relationship is stuff that you only find out from back and forth. We form our relationships, we form our friendships in exactly the same way that chimps and gorillas form their friendships, still do to this day, actually, which is they pick at each other's hair, they groom each other. And the more time you spend as a gorilla or a chimpanzee grooming another one, the more that individual is going to come to your aid when there's a predator or a big nasty male comes around and is being despotic or something like that. We do the same thing. It's just that we evolved this amazing capacity to groom lots of people at once, and that's called language. So that's what made us socially smarter. we were able to start talking to multiple people. Then we needed more brain space in order to have in our head our concept of more people, of those individuals and who they are, which then created more incentive to be better at language, etc. That's where human intelligence comes from. It's a social intelligence. And we've evolved that social intelligence in large part because what we have is this complex negotiation of not just what I say I can bring to the relationship and what you say and what we put out there in front of us, but what isn't being said. And what's being told by somebody's, the way they treat the waiter, the way that they treat their mother, etc. And also this game, this negotiation that you're playing about what it is that you bring and what it is that you offer and will you stay and won't you, and all those things requires enormous intelligence. And when I was young and at university, we would go to parties and we would find people and we would chat, and maybe the conversations weren't that great and they were very beery and the likes, but at least while you were assessing someone's looks, you were also assessing something of their personality and their interests. And you would find very quickly that lots of people are really dull. Now you have to set up and swipe right on 1,000 profiles and set up a date and go to the place and sit for a while and commit an evening only to find out that they're very dull or whatever it is. And certainly at this point, it's much easier to do the looks stuff than it is to do the personality and the compatibility stuff. And I'm very reluctant to ever say computers will never be able to do this or never be able to do that, because very quickly I'm always proved wrong, or anybody who says that is always proved wrong. But that's the big challenge.
Yes, indeed. And also to just button up a thought I had, if we just want to name it the bright billboard or the shiny bright object, I think it's a wonderful thing when one strives to better oneself, one's situation. Also with a mate, as long as it's also underlined. For example, if I see this person and they are just so talented in the arts and something, and either I come from a perspective like that's their gig and I love that they do that, I have my stuff, I won't feel bad if they excel even further, or it's something that inspires me where I do the work and I also grow. Then I think there's a beautiful basis for sustainability, right? When the partners make each other grow, evolve together, bring out the best in each other. But of course, if you stay the way you are, you're reluctant to change and grow and put in the work, and then start begrudging a partner for, let's say, more social status, quote, better looks, more money, then that's a recipe for a disaster. Rob, in your work, you've shown how sexual selection underpins human behavior across various domains, from art to social status. And this idea that sexual competition has shaped cultural phenomena like the arts, music, fashion is fascinating. And it suggests that what we consider creative expression is actually potentially, in fact, a product of these evolutionary processes, right? And given that idea that cultural expressions are shaped by sexual competition, how do you see this manifesting in today's hyper-connected social media world, where individuals, like we already mentioned before for the dating apps and social media, where individuals curate their identities for an invisible audience? Are we seeing an amplification of evolutionary behaviors, or is technology actually distorting them?
It can be both. It's a really deep question. To begin with something fairly straightforward, what we know about the posting of sexy selfies, the business of doing the lips and getting the good angle and the good lighting and posting a picture that makes you look as attractive as possible. We've actually done some research. My colleague Candice Blake and a couple of others and I did some work in which Candice basically got reams of data over years from Instagram and Twitter of people posting these sexy selfies. And the question is why? In some respects, thirst trapping, it's going to bring audience, it's going to build engagement, etc. But we go, is that because people are wanting to find a mate for themselves? Or are they simply tapping into the urge on the part of other people to go, that's somebody I might like as a mate, but that's not really the business they're in as much as really finding a mate? It's quite hard to disentangle this, but in academic research, if you ask why do women in particular post sexy selfies, they'll say that's because of gender inequity. Women and men are treated differently. Women have to pimp themselves up and look nice and have flawless makeup, etc., because there's beauty double standards and all sorts of other double standards, and that's absolutely true in a lot of ways. But there are other possible explanations too. So we went and we thought we'd test this. So we've got Candace figured out a very clever algorithm for geolocating tweets and Instagram posts to where they were sent from. And she, based on the information people provide themselves, it's not some secret kind of thing. And so we were able to do this within the United States as well as to country. And what we found was that gender inequality is a middle of the road predictor. It's not a great predictor. It's not consistent. So places where women have less economic power, less education, less social power, less political power are not necessarily places where they post sexy selfies. So this isn't just a way out of, this is the only avenue available to me is I have to shake it. No, that doesn't seem to be the case. But what is the case is that income inequality, so the inequality between rich and poor, irrespective of gender, is by far the most consistent predictor of this. And we looked a little further and we looked at spending on hair salons and on makeup and on clothes and on luxury goods. All of those things go up under high income inequality. And the argument here is that when everybody's equal or close to equal, the incentive to strive for social mobility, for economic mobility, is much weaker than when there are big differences between rich and poor. And so in those places where there are big differences in rich and poor, women are self-sexualizing more online. There are other things that people do online, which we may get onto later in the show, that are consistent with this. But so women are self-sexualizing more online. We couldn't quite get to the bottom whether they were self-sexualizing in order to achieve upward mobility via partnering with somebody or via simply having a good brand. But we tend to think there's enough evidence that it's largely your brand, because this is how people work. This is how people make money. This is one of those, it's like sport used to be. Playing football or boxing used to be a very good way to get rich for folks who didn't have very much to start with. So you don't necessarily need a whole production studio behind you to become an influencer. You just need to learn really quickly, a little bit of technology and some creativity. And so we think that that's probably what's going on. But what's happening is that this is something that emerges from mating preferences and from sort of deepest kind of feelings about what isn't attractive, layered in terms of cultural, thousands of years of culture in terms of what those things mean, and then people interpreting them in a new way for a new technology to benefit themselves.
Yes. And Rob, your research also has shown that this, what you just spoke about, the income inequality, it has very far-reaching effects, whether that's in the competition for mates or social status. And I find it really compelling to think that these economic disparities, they could not only drive behaviors like the one we just talked about, but social unrest and perhaps also mating strategies that further entrench these inequalities. So I'm curious, Rob, how do you see income inequality shaping social behaviors, especially if we talk about status competition and relationships? And could addressing economic disparities lead to a more stable social structure, both for the human relationships as well as societal cohesion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the most important issues. And I don't think that societies tend to have very mature conversations about this because of left-right political polarization. There's the notion that as soon as you start talking about tamping down on inequality, you're waging class warfare. It's a long way between saying we should tax the wealthy and saying that there needs to be a Marxist revolution, nonetheless. And societies vary in a variety of states and even in places within a country. So a good example is some of our other work on Twitter, incels. So incels, involuntary celibate people. It started out as a woman who wanted to build a community for folks who were having trouble finding a mate, but it's really been co-opted by a certain brand of angry young man who basically blames women for not sleeping with them.
Yeah.
And I think these guys are partly tainted by the fact that they see so many attractive people out there, including self-sexualizing on social media, and they seem to think that that would be their natural due. We looked at the words incels use, the terms that they use, the things that they say online. And this is only in the continental United States for this particular paper. And there is a lot of variation in the US between places that are high inequality and places that are relatively more equitable. And what we found again was that not only was income inequality incredibly high, good as a predictor of incel activity, gender equality was as well. But in this case, the more equal the genders were, as in people earned similar amounts, had similar levels of schooling, similar opportunities, the more equal they were, the more incels there were. Now, the incels will tell you this. They'll say, ever since the 1940s, we've had this like sexual revolution, and it basically caused very ordinary men not to be able to find a mate because getting up and going to work no longer turns you into the catch that it might have done in the 1950s. And fair play to them. They've interpreted one of the causes of their dilemma at a macro level. And the other thing was sex ratio, where there are more young men than young women. You also get a high incel incidence. That makes sense because if everybody pairs up, somebody's left standing at the end of the night kind of thing. So those three predictors, but especially income inequality, really drove this incel phenomenon. And that makes absolute sense because high income inequality, we know, causes what's called young male syndrome, which is that young men with relatively poor prospects, they can't just work their way out of it working at a fast food stall or doing relatively menial work, which may be the only work that's available to them, or the work that, if they're lucky, kind of thing. They have to take some kind of a risk to get up, the old get rich or die trying thing. And so young men are more inclined to do silly things like take risks, do spectacular stunts, etc., in the hope of catching people's attention. Don't know that it necessarily works. And involved in jostling for status and respect that also occasionally involve violence. And some of that violence occasionally results in incidental homicide. It's not necessarily someone going around to someone's house to kill them, two guys punching on in the street and somebody falls over and cracks their head or something. So that kind of homicide has this huge groundswell or iceberg of other types of violence and competition and striving for status and respect beneath it. And we've known since at least the 1980s that income inequality is by far the most reliable predictor of this. Where there are big differences between rich and poor, people are more likely to strive in that way and take those kinds of chances.
Mm-hmm.
Income inequality has other corrosive effects. It affects people's health. It affects obesity. It affects all sorts of things. Sorry, my dog's just snored next to me. He has this habit of coming every time I'm on a podcast and doing that. And so income inequality is hugely corrosive. And we're finding this out. And with the evolutionary framework of it, that this is really about the difference between leaving no descendants and having potentially lots and lots of descendants is what's driving this, particularly among young men. And that's where we're at with that kind of stuff, illustrating that you can go from the fairly mundane looking things that we're already used to people doing in their daily life and go back in time and say, this is a manifestation of a set of adaptations we have to strive and take risks, but only when those risks are necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And thank you for sharing and explaining this to us, Rob. I think it's really important to realize how economic inequalities drive this frustration amongst young men. And it's compelling also to see that this is not just about the access to mates, but it's a much deeper social and economic exclusion that exacerbates these feelings. And while I absolutely have sympathy for individuals who are lonely, who feel separate, who have less access in a lot of ways, I absolutely do not have sympathy for the violence and the misogyny that comes out of this. Now, that being said, all of us have been young at some point, and most of us have done some things that might have not been that great. But for me, a line really gets stepped over when there's also calls to violence, like you see in a lot of these incel forums, or even taking action, and where people feel they're owed something. and where it's literally over the bodies of somebody else who should be consenting. And I have friends, I'm blessed with a really eclectic group of friends that are not all in one clique, all different ages, different socioeconomic status, different cultures they come from. They vote differently, they pray differently, they eat differently. I love it. So what I've really been hearing from a lot of women, a lot of high achieving women who they're economically independent, they're doing incredible things in the world, is they often not so much so are looking for a male who has as much financially as them or more, but they're looking for a partner who has, unless he's already there, but who's either doing the work or has done the work of emotionally maturing, intellectually maturing, where they can meet on eye level, right? And where he doesn't need to, again, it's not necessarily tied to the money. And this is something that I also find fascinating looking at incel culture, because it's basically, this is who I am and I'm owed all this. I don't need to change. Like, maybe if you were more invested in actually growing certain aspects of yourself, you would also become more attractive to whoever you want to attract. But talking about addressing this incel issue, it requires more than just focusing on the gender relations and misogyny, which of course is rampant. Should we be looking at broader socioeconomic reforms addressing income inequality, improving social mobility for young men as part of the solution? And how could that look like?
I think that addressing income inequality is something that's absolutely worth doing anyway, for all the reasons. It doesn't, even before you get to incels, there is sufficient evidence that people's health and mental health in particular, but also things like obesity, etc., are affected by very high levels of inequality. I think that's something that you don't see often enough in discussions about taxation, about how we're going to structure societies in that regard. And it's obviously always hijacked by, on one side, more workers, this is what minimum wages need to be, which is part of that equation. And then on the other side, wealthy people going, we need incentives to strive. And economists have got a whole range of possible tools. I was just discussing with Michael Muthukrishna the other day the possibility of land taxes, where land taxes, he said people are terrified of land tax because they think that their house is going to be taxed out from under them. But basically, he said it's largely mining companies and speculative real estate investors who have huge amounts of land outside of cities that they aren't doing anything with, but they're hoping one day to be able to basically rent seek. So with that kind of a tax, where what you're basically doing is you're taxed for the space that you're occupying, not what you're doing to improve it, though, that creates incentives to do things to improve it, not just on the land, but to do other productive things like invest in businesses rather than invest in real estate speculation. And he reckons that would rectify a great deal of inequality, including the inequality in the housing market, which, I mean, I'm sure in Los Angeles it's absolutely appalling given the real estate shows that seem to come onto my Netflix. But in Sydney, it's tragic. I have 4 young people in my home, 2 kids and 2 stepkids, and I don't know how they're going to even rent, much less buy a place. And so proposals that will allow folks who work hard to achieve social mobility will be incentive for people to work hard, rather than sitting around stewing about their fate and thinking that other people need to sort this out for them.
Yes.
Everything that you've said about the toxic side of inceldom and of other types of fulminating about inequalities or about unfairness, particularly the misogyny, particularly the openness to violence, etc. I 100% agree with you. And I think that we're not going back to that kind of era of the 1940s in which the differences between what women and men could earn and the opportunities available to women and men were so different that really men were not only guaranteed a job, but guaranteed that if they have a job, somebody somewhere is going to be able to achieve upward mobility by marrying them. That itself caused so many problems for people, much less all the other things that the inequalities caused for people. And we live in this incredible time in which folks are less restrained in what they're able to achieve on the basis of their gender and their background, etc., in countries like the United States and Australia, at least, than has ever been true in any society since maybe the egalitarian foraging bands that may or may not have been our ancestors. Where do we go with inequality? I think that there needs to be some broad discourse about the toxic effects of it and the fact that people might react in ways that we're very unsympathetic to, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to challenge the root cause, because there's a lot of people who are suffering in silence and with dignity, and who know that it's not women's fault that you're unattractive. It's just it's a combination of your fault and your circumstances. And then we create circumstances in which people can do that work that you spoke about, whether it's work to improve yourself economically or to offer something else in a relationship.
100%, Rob. I agree with you. And just an interesting side note on the foraging communities that may have been our ancestors and that were very egalitarian. When you look at the works of some anthropologists, everything was shared as a resource, whether it was food or shelter or even sex. It is thought of that sex was shared very freely, because sex back in the day, they wouldn't even have known when is a woman actually fertile, right? And it was something also for the cohesion of the community. Multiple lovers, male, female, multiple lovers, they all supported each other. They all raised the kids together. In a sense, at least if you want to idealize it as an idea, because obviously we can't beam ourselves back right now and look at the actual facts of that living together, that cohabitation. But it seems like a much more peaceful way, and people weren't deprived of partnership, of sex, of food, of shelter. All was a communal resource. Obviously, we can't and we don't want to go back to the 1940s, and we also can't and don't want to go back to these types of foraging communities. So looking at what we have now, and we spoke about, of course, what economists could potentially come up with and have come up with, and hopefully it can get implemented. In what ways do you think we as societies, so not as economists, but as societies, how could we proactively channel the frustration of these young men who feel left behind in a way that could reduce their susceptibility to these harmful ideologies like incel subcultures? What role, for example, does education play, and even cultural shifts around masculinity?
Good question. Look, I think that you're coming at this question with the sort of underlying conception that if only we could get the conditions right, we could make this problem go away. And I'm less optimistic about that. So historically, the incel problem has been solved in a number of ways. One of which was that people would basically go to war. And so that it's not, Napoleon has this famous statement in which he's speaking to Clemens von Metternich, I think it was the Minister of State for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he said, "You can't stop me. I use 30,000 men a month," which basically means 30,000 men were dying every month in his campaigns. Because what made Napoleon great, one of the many things, he was a great strategist, but was his approach to logistics, including recruitment. So he basically had a conscription system in which French men had to go into the army, and they were very efficiently brought into the army. So he won the numbers game in most cases. And that's how warfare used to be. Everybody gets a little bit upset because there's lots of young men who are unable to find a mate. Remember that women used to die in childbirth a lot in those days. So you've got fewer women than you've got men in a time of peace because of this natural attrition from childbirth. In addition to that, if men are living to 50, 60 years old, women are menopausal at that point, the 50, 60-year-old man might want a second or a third wife because his other two wives have gone. So that numbers game stacks up as a huge surplus of men. And when you have a surplus of men, you have either internal conflict within the society, you have revolution and political discontent, or you blame it on the people on the other side of the river, and you march over there and you try and thump them, or they try and thump you. And as a result of that is there are a lot of young men who are lost who would have been the incels of their generation. And the young men who go off to war They go off as practically incels. And when they're over there, they either die or they earn their chance, they earn that increase in status and respect that comes from being a decorated soldier who's done good things for the country, etc. Sounds all very clinical and very optimistic. But the point is that there was this huge attrition of young men. And similarly, sending men off to further wars in colonies on other continents and stuff had a similar kind of effect for the folks who were colonizing, at least, who's the people whose opinion we hear most about in history books. That's not an ideal situation. I think we're pretty comfortable here in the 21st century knowing that whilst we still send people off to places of conflict, and whilst there are now wars flaring up around the world in a way that we perhaps are unused to over the last 20 or 30 years, that simply, sending large numbers of young men off to fight is not going to solve your incel problem at all. So are there other types of solutions? I think there's one solution that's it's a bit hard to stomach because it's bundled up in the misogyny stuff. And that is that given the number of incels we have, given we're not losing young men in warfare anymore, etc., there's actually in places like the United States, there's actually fairly low levels, at least in terms of the incel homicides, multiple homicides. You see them from time to time. They're obviously a symptom of something. Underneath that, there's a lot of other simmering violence and discontent, etc. But it's not this society-shaping kind of revolutionary force that it has been in a lot of places where people are being hugely radicalized in large numbers, it overturned some of the dynasties in China. There was history was changed by their surplus of incels at various times. And that doesn't seem to be happening now. And I think one of the reasons is that young men in particular are hugely distracted. And they're distracted largely by pornography and things related to pornography. And now I think that with virtual friends, these chatbots that can emulate friendship and can talk to you like a friend, but can also talk to you like a lover and engage in sort of sexy talk, etc. And people might not go, look, I'm using a lot of porn and I'm chatting to my virtual friend over here, and so therefore I'm okay. There's still a psychological feeling that this is not great, and the people around them are looking at them and going, this is not great, but it is distracting them. Time spent doing that is time not spent organizing a revolution, or time not spent going out and doing incredibly risky stuff with guns and fast cars. And that's not a solution. It's not a prescription that a society goes, what we need is to just improve the quality of the internet so that we can really get more porn into homes. Because obviously folks see that there are other sides to that can also be, that I'm certainly not anti-porn, but I am well enough aware that it's not just a one-way street in terms of rampant benefits for everybody involved. You can see that growth of that particular sector of the economy has probably saved us from a whole lot of other antisocial things that incels in particular would be doing.
Yes, very true, Rob. And I find what you just said also about what you also talk about it in your book, Artificial Intimacy, where you bring to light a future where relationships with AI and these virtual beings, avatars, might not just be commonplace, but maybe for some people even preferable. And this blurring the lines between human and machine intimacy also brings to the forefront of the mind some pretty interesting and also pressing ethical and psychological questions about, what is the future of our relationships? And talking about that, what do you see as the psychological consequences of really widespread adoption of AI companions? I think right now we're seeing just the mere beginning of it. But what would happen with a way more widespread adoption of these AI companions for human intimacy? Do you think that would be, if we start relying on these artificial patterns, would that diminish or maybe grow our capacity for emotional depth, also in real human relationships, or would it do the opposite?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I don't really know the answer in terms of what it will do. So I tend to break the consequence of these things down into three possible types of consequence. One is the consequences for the user themselves. So the person who has a sex robot at home or has a virtual friend that they chat to. And then there's the consequences for the people that person interacts with. And then there's the broader society level consequences. So we've already touched on the society level consequences to some extent, in that maybe what this is doing is it's distracting people from doing otherwise destructive things, but it might also be distracting them from doing otherwise constructive things, like improving their skills and working hard on their careers, building things, etc. Freud certainly recognized that the incel, obviously he didn't have the terms for it, but that the striving for status and respect that would lead to mating is also the striving that leads to a lot of creative forces in society. And that's in terms of everybody, not just young men. But in terms of the consequences for the users themselves, I think that it's quite likely that we're going to find people who go down a rabbit hole of only having relationships online, with only having relationships with AI, and find that meets their needs enough that they don't go out and do other things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wary of being too down on that, because I think people have been saying this since that about the internet, about television, about the radio, probably about books back in the day. I think Plato or Socrates or someone had something to say about writing, basically that folks would just stop engaging socially with one another. And it's true, but also our capacities to be social, incredibly flexible. So I wouldn't be too dark on that, apart from the fact that I think that if these virtual friends are able to be compelling conversational companions, and we're right on the cusp of that at the moment in terms of the latest technologies. You look at OpenAI's just released ChatGPT 4.0 with advanced voice mode, and suddenly it's chatting to you like full-on conversation. I think that we're going to find people have at the moment, those are wholesome. Even the sexy ones are wholesome. But if you look at the internet, what's happened is it fragmented into some fairly dark places. So are folks going to be getting the social feedback from their dark chatbot that makes them into worse people? Because folks don't go at television time, they don't go for the wholesome stuff and the educational stuff. Some people do because they recognize that's important, but the vast majority of people go for the stuff that's escapist, and some of it is potentially quite harmful, sort of fueling consumerism, etc. So I think at the very best we can hope for a draw with the chatbots in terms of, will they be good companions to the people that they're using, and that are using them, sorry. And then that middle one, which is the effects on people that the user knows. I think that's a really interesting possibility. I've played with some of these virtual friend chatbots in my research, and they're very good at remembering your name, remembering some of the things you said. They have, core memories that they're considered to be their favorite memories of your time together. So you have some continuity of the relationship that the people who go, that might be better than nothing, but it's not enough. I would say some people, all they have is nothing. They're isolated, they're socially anxious, they live a lot, they're physically isolated as well as socially isolated, and they perhaps have obnoxious personalities. I don't know. This is good for them because this is something that they need. However, having a chatbot that remembers everything about you and that feeds you the kinds of things that you want to hear all the time, and that never really disagrees with you or says, you know what, you're absolutely full of it, get over yourself, etc. That is a concern. I think we're going to have a very big natural experiment right now to find out whether or not people really need that in their lives, or whether they just go down the narcissistic plug hole. Impossible to say at this point.
Yes, ideally, such a chatbot would also gently nudge you towards learning how to actually interact also in real life. So not only would there be an aspect of satisfaction and feeling connection and excitement, there would also be this opportunity of very playful, natural learning. So people who do not have much confidence in social situation, and even less so in potentially romantic or dating, mating situations, could acquire the skills that are it's not easy in real life to learn it out in the wild, right? The possibility to fall flat on your face, get rejected, get even more hurt and isolated inside are pretty high. So I do hope that there is also some element that'll come to play that'll actually help people move out of this social isolation and the social anxiety by giving them tools and in a playful way learning how to actually interact with other human beings that they're desirous of. Yeah, remains to, as you said, it remains to be seen and will all play out, Rob.
The tricky
Um,
thing there is the incentive structures. It's like saying it'd be nice if breakfast cereals didn't have sugar in them. The companies who are selling them are going to put sugar in them because they want people to like them. And I would love to see exactly that kind of thing built into these chatbots around. But at the same time, yes, if you say, hey, look, I'm socially isolated, get me the best product that you can and I'll pay for it. That's one thing. And some folks will definitely benefit from those kinds of products. There are already products out there to help with that kind of thing. But will all friend chatbots do that? No. And in fact, the thing is that we have friends. We have friends because our friends entertain us and we like them and we enjoy being around them. But as they come to have an interest in us, as they come to think of us as part of themselves, they will occasionally intervene and say, hey, you know what? You're drinking too much. Hey, you need to stop with the misogynistic ranting, etc. And I just can't see how that incentive is going to be built in to a chatbot that when people sulk and go off by themselves for a while, but they'll probably just uninstall it, is my guess, rather than have the continuity of the friend who comes around and goes, all right, I know you don't like what I said yesterday, but it's true, but I still love you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, oh gosh. I'm keeping my hopes up that at least partially it will be beneficial and actually help evolve society as we know it, not just tear us further down.
Mm.
We look at how AI is embedded in so many aspects of our lives, from the recommendations of algorithms, social media, wherever we go, dating apps, to virtual assistants, gosh, to the chatbots. It raises also the question whether we're becoming too dependent on these systems, and potentially we're outsourcing very important cognitive functions that actually shaped our evolutionary success that got us to where we are now. So, how do you think, Rob, that the increasing reliance on AI and the decision making of AI might affect our cognitive abilities and also our evolutionary adaptations in the long run?
That's a fantastic question. So that I have a paper coming out in a couple of weeks' time, and I'm thinking of a book along these lines, basically saying how is AI going to shape human evolution? If you were to Google that question, you would get a lot of AI gurus saying things like, we'll become these human machine cyborgs and super intelligent and blah, blah, blah. And that's all very spectacular. But I really mean the more mundane, everybody, even the poorest people in society, etc., how is this going to affect them? And the one prediction that I'm really confident in making is that our brains will get smaller. And the reason I say that is that our brains have already got smaller, certainly over the last 5,000 years, possibly as much as 30,000 years, because it's from fossils, it's hard to get a precise estimate of when they stopped getting much bigger, which they were, and started getting smaller. And the reason is not that we've become less intelligent. It's that our intelligence, our collective intelligence, is less dependent on one individual knowing everything. Because since humans became these incredible storytelling cultural creatures that have common mythologies and can agree to a common accounts of the world, even if they're mythological ones, that meant that, or that kind of information could be stored across a lot of people. And when that happens, the pressure for one individual to know everything, or so we say the benefit of knowing everything and of knowing everyone that was possible to know at the time, etc., is no longer so beneficial that having an even bigger brain is a good thing. We know that having a smaller brain is a good thing because babies with big heads are much harder to birth. And historically, that's meant that somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 10 pregnancies resulted in death in childbirth. The other thing is that a baby's brain, because brain tissue is so expensive energetically to run, a baby's brain demands so much energy from the mother in the last trimester of pregnancy that it's like she's running a marathon every day in terms of energy. You imagine that you're feeding someone else. So those two things alone mean that any gene that makes the brain slightly smaller without a cost to intelligence is actually going to be favored. And as a result, we have this evolutionary shrinking of the brain. Now, take away instead of it just being remembering cultural stories and myths and who owes what to whom, which is what cultural intelligence, that shared intelligence used to do. Now we have shared intelligence in that everything that's ever been known can be accessed from a computer on the internet. And so we don't have to do the storage of information the same way. We don't have to, we can write things down and we can keep records of who owes whom what to whom. We can do ancestry, DNA ancestry, and figure out who's related to whom. All of those kinds of things can be stored somewhere else. And we don't need to do the calculation. I don't have to differentiate or integrate any calculus equations anymore because that's done on a computer. I don't have to remember how to look up things in trigonometry anymore. I can't even remember what they're called because that's done on a calculator. And so AI is just going to get better and better at that in terms of holding that information, giving it back to us in a digestible way, probably writing that for us. And so as a species, we'll still be smart. We'll be much smarter than we ever were, but that won't be because necessarily of super smart individuals in the same way. And so I expect our brains will get smaller. So that's one obvious example. Another one is, seems like social media, the rise of social media and smartphones is associated with an increase in young people's mood disorders, anxiety and depression, and self-harm. And so we can expect that social media is not going to go anywhere. Smartphones are not going to go anywhere, or they might go in a different format. The same kind of function is still going to be there. So what we might find is very strong natural selection on the capacity to be at ease with this, to not be made depressed, because some people are able to be smartphone junkies and be fine, and some people, something about it makes them more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety. And so we may expect that whole underlying complex of what causes mood disorders, etc., might be reshaped by natural selection in the coming generations.
Fascinating. I had not even thought about that, Rob. Yeah, I do know how a lot of researchers, scientists make the connection between mood disorders and smartphones. And it could be that people move less. It could be that people have less real face-to-face time in real life, all these things that we are still hardwired for. And also really interesting what you said about that it's not necessary anymore for individuals to store all this information because it already is, and even more so, it's going to be readily available for us. So the size of the brain aside, Rob, what do you personally think? Could this reliance on these technologies ultimately make us less adaptable as a species, or potentially more adaptable because maybe we have more hard drive space, so to speak, for other things that we have been kept from?
Yeah, I think we might be able to become more creative. Some individuals are going to be able to turn that over into, I don't have to remember the names and dates of all of the wars in Europe, and I'm using that brain time to be a better artist. Of course, the artists are having a tough time right now because generative AI is turning everybody into some kind of an artist. But whatever the artists of the futures would be, people could spend time making really creative and interesting podcasts, for example, where that is something that folks wouldn't have had the time for. So I absolutely think that it could be a bonus for creativity. I think there's a very real risk that anything that knocks out the infrastructure for that collective knowledge of the internet and of AI is likely to set us back a very long time, probably back to way before the beginning of the internet. Now, the internet is built in a way that's supposed to be pretty much robust to that. In fact, that was the whole point of the military research that led to the internet, is that communication system wouldn't just go down with a single attack. But that's the kind of attack that people were envisioning in the 50s and 60s. There's no doubt that folks are going to blame whatever it is that they're upset about in the world on AI and on the internet. And at some point, somebody's going to rise up and try and do something against it. And that protecting that kind of infrastructure, and therefore our cultural sort of co-inheritance, is going to become a very important part of human security. Whether or not there are creative ways to do it, I'm sure there are, because people are smart, and even when their motives are even delusional, which they may be, you'll still see that folks are able to leverage what they know in interesting ways. So maybe some kind of a virus that wipes the whole thing out, or I don't know. So there is a concern there that we might lose out in that regard. But if the internet goes down and AI goes down, we might be in more trouble than just not having the shared information on very sophisticated things. We may find that our healthcare systems go back to pre-19th century levels. I don't know.
Rob, yeah. This has been a really fascinating and intriguing conversation for me. I'm really grateful you made time for us. For people who would like to learn more, obviously, they can read your most excellent books. Where else can they find you, connect with you, and do a deeper dive into your work?
I think the best intro would probably be .net. That's my website for my writing, but it also has some of my professional connections there, and I can be reached that way. I'm best reached on email, but I can also be reached through Twitter. So it's Brooks_Rob. So that's probably the social medium that I'm most likely to talk about ideas on.
Super. Rob, thank you so much. It was really a great pleasure to be able to pick your brain.
It's a fascinating conversation, Ariane. What a pleasure.